Good afternoon. Welcome to a very interesting conversation about indigenous peoples, climate change, emerging research on traditional knowledge and livelihoods. May I invite you to take your seats? We will start in approximately 1 minute. There's still some serious picture taking in the room here, but I think we start now our event, and we would kindly ask our colleagues, after they have taken the picture with the special rapporteur, which is very important, that they kindly take their seats as well and stay with us. My name is Martin Oelz. I work as a leader of the Indigenous Peoples team at the ILO headquarters in Geneva. We join the Permanent Forum session every year, as you can imagine. The ILO is the host of the Convention 169, which celebrates 30 years this year. And we are very pleased to start a series of side events that we're engaging in this year with a very important topic, which is indigenous peoples, climate change, and how this relates to traditional knowledge and livelihoods. We are very pleased to have a very important lineup of speakers here, and I would like to also draw your attention that we are today also launching a new report on this subject, and we have the pleasure to have two of the main authors with us on this panel, and this is a report that we have prepared together with a group of researchers and with the University of Oxford. So this is the reason why we're here together, to listen to some of those that were involved in this research, and then to have also a very diverse representation of different actors from international organizations, from indigenous peoples, from academia, from government, to react to the report and to describe these issues, how they see it from their perspective. So this is going to be a very interesting and participatory debate, and we will start off actually with Mr. Rishabh Deer. He's an ILO colleague of mine who has been behind conceiving this research enterprise together with a colleague from University of Oxford, Ariel Ahern, who is on my left, and these two will give us an introduction to this research enterprise, and then we go into the other speakers. So I would be very pleased to give the floor to Rishabh to start the introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin, for this, and thank you, colleagues, for joining us today for this event on emerging research on traditional knowledge. It has taken about a year and a half for us to come up with this publication, which covers case studies across Asia, Pacific, and Latin America. Now, to begin with, we realized that in the past few years, there is growing importance in the international frameworks on traditional knowledge, on indigenous people specifically, whether we look at the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development, whether it is the Paris Agreement on climate change, whether it is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is quite clear that the focus on indigenous peoples is strong, and increasingly there's also focus on traditional knowledge. Yet, while there is this focus at the international level on indigenous peoples, we see that there are many challenges that indigenous peoples face, which is magnified by climate change. And these challenges are at the intersection between development, climate change, and rights. In our previous research, we found that there are a combination of threats that indigenous peoples face when it comes to climate change, which include poverty and inequality, livelihoods insecurity, geographic remoteness and vulnerability, migration and dependence on the informal economy, specifically due to climate change, gender inequalities, which can also get magnified due to climate change, and a lack of recognition, rights, institutional support, and inclusion in public policies. Now, these aspects make the situation of indigenous peoples in several countries rather unique, and it's different from the poor in general. So this leads to a situation of marginalization or impoverishment that is exacerbated when we put climate change into the mix. However, increasingly, we also see that indigenous peoples are recognized as agents of change, and they're not just victims in this story, they're not just subjects of development. They're fundamental partners and crucial agents of change to achieve the sustainable development goals for effective climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as to build a green economy specifically based on traditional knowledge. So why this focus on traditional knowledge, and how does it connect to, say, occupations and to skills, issues which are very relevant to the ILO? Now, we see that the role of traditional knowledge is specifically identified in the Paris Agreement. We see it specifically identified in the Sendai framework as aspects which can lead to innovation, which can lead to green jobs, which can even lead to enterprises such as cooperatives among indigenous peoples rooted in traditional knowledge. After all, indigenous peoples care for 22% of the Earth's surface and protect nearly 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. But when we look at traditional knowledge specifically in the world of work, we see that as a concept, as a way of life, it cuts across multiple sectors, whether it is forestry, whether it is agriculture, fisheries. But interestingly, traditional knowledge blends culture with economic and environmental sustainability as well as resilience. In some cases, we also find that knowledge systems and customary institutions are shaping new forms of management of economic activity. That is, that alternative business models rooted in customary institutions and knowledge systems are also being developed, new models of profit sharing, new models of cooperatives. Through these, we see there are many indigenous communities which are sustainably using natural resources, maintaining these natural resources, and generating incomes at the same time. So for us, we notice that these are nothing but unique forms of skill sets which are very important in the fight against climate change. At the same time, we notice that traditional knowledge systems are not functioning in isolation. They are engaging with the changes in the world around. So they are also adapting. Transformations in economies, in societies, in institutions, as well as modern technologies, these are all impacting traditional knowledge systems, and they are borrowing from it and advancing in certain directions. So for instance, indigenous communities are employing the latest technological advancements alongside their knowledge systems in cases where they want to protect forests, where they want to better understand changing weather patterns, or even build green businesses. Yet, when we talk about traditional knowledge from the lens of the world of work, we see many challenges remain, such as discrimination, or little access to formal training, or the formal economy, the recognition of traditional knowledge in the formal economic setup, as well as putting value to traditional knowledge as a viable economic way forward, or a viable skill which can lead to economic gains. There is also a mismatch and non-recognitions of such skills in this situation. However, when we look at the modern day labor markets, the innovation that is needed and the economy that is capable of addressing climate change, we see that the unique skill sets associated with traditional knowledge are all the more important today. For instance, we have seen examples of co-benefits, of synergies, whether it is, say, in Brazil, where forest rights for indigenous communities and government protection of these rights empowered communities to preserve forests, and deforestation rates were less than 1%, and CO2 emissions outside of indigenous community managed forests was 27 times more, and these are very, very significant numbers. Similarly, there are cases of resilience where traditional knowledge of indigenous communities saved thousands of lives when the Indian Ocean tsunami came in 2004, to the extent where they were awarded an award by the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. So there are lots of opportunities for leveraging traditional knowledge to unleash innovation, to create green jobs and enterprises, to strengthen climate action and achieve sustainable development. At the same time, this is also a route to addressing gender inequalities. Indigenous women and girls already play a vital role in both traditional and non-traditional livelihoods as well as in unpaid care work. They are often the custodians of traditional knowledge. So their contributions are unique. They're vital, especially in the context of natural resource management, agriculture, and forestry. And these are sectors which are all very important for climate mitigation and adaptation. So building on these initial findings, we worked on this compendium of case studies, this volume, to better understand what does traditional knowledge mean in everyday practice. So when we talk to policymakers, what do we tell them? That give us examples of traditional knowledge, to move beyond the concept and to go into the concrete nature of what this is. So we try to address the gaps by providing policymakers with these examples of how traditional knowledge is working at the grassroots level. The research has been directly conducted with communities in different countries across Asia and the Pacific, Africa and the Americas by scholars from very diverse backgrounds. It showcases the experiences of communities, but also of the knowledge systems and of the occupations of indigenous peoples as they engage with the natural world, with economic and government systems, as well as modern science and technology. And in conclusion, we see that for a green future of work, a world of work that must confront climate change, the decent work agenda becomes very important for indigenous peoples and for promoting the traditional knowledge for indigenous peoples, because at the end, traditional knowledge is manifested in their world of work. And so the decent work agenda as a framework for empowering women and men becomes a vital driver for sustainable development. And for the ILO, this is it's something which provides an integrated solution to rather complex problems that indigenous peoples face, underpinned by the ILO conventions and recommendations, particularly Convention number 169, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, while at the same time the ILO is celebrating its centenary this year. The ILO also has the 2015 strategy, which focuses on indigenous people's rights for inclusive and sustainable development. And with a specific focus on climate change, there are the guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all, to ensure that no one is left behind in the transition to the green economy. So essentially, the idea behind this is to put people first, investing in people and communities to solve social, economic, and environmental problems. And one step in this direction is to have adequate research on how to promote traditional knowledge and what does traditional knowledge mean in everyday practice for indigenous communities. On that note, I can end.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that really quick overview of where we were coming from when we started to work on this report, and also how this report has actually also helped the ILO to kind of strengthen and fine-tune its analysis on these issues, how informality, the rural economy, indigenous peoples, decent work, how this links actually to the broader issues of development and climate change. Now, I'll pass on without further delay to the co-author here from the University of Oxford, Dr. Ariel Ahern, and I would like to say also very much in the beginning, thank you very much to the University of Oxford, the School of Geography, for engaging with us on this very exciting research project. You have been working with communities directly. You have been engaged in interdisciplinary research in many ways. So we would like to hear from you what you see about this research project and how you see it, and in which directions is it pointing, the results that we're seeing from that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the ILO for their invitation to join this event. It's really a pleasure to be here to represent our collaboration and to sit alongside the esteemed colleagues on this panel. So I would like to talk a little bit about the School for Geography and the Environment, some of the research we do, the collaboration that we formed with the ILO and the objectives of this compendium, as well as themes within the compendium. Hopefully it will motivate everyone to read it and learn more about the cases that we investigate. So the School for Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford is one of the world's leading geography departments and is a highly multidisciplinary setting. It spans physical and social sciences, and we house 3 research clusters within the school. This includes the Environmental Change Institute, the Transport Studies Unit, and the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. Our research clusters span topics such as geomorphology, biodiversity conservation, economy and society, to more abstract theories around materialities and mobility. The connecting fiber in all of this diverse academic setting is our attention to the physical environment. As human geographers, we're really interested in the relationship between society and the environment and the dynamic processes between them. So concepts of space and place are central to the research we do and our teaching curriculum. And I think this is highlighted also in the compendium that has come together. So much of the research we do engages with publics beyond just academia. I know a lot of people might think of Oxford as being in the ivory tower, but we actually try to make as much of an effort as possible to collaborate with stakeholders from a range of professional and cultural backgrounds. Increasingly, our research questions are formed in consultation with core stakeholder groups in an effort to practice more participatory research. For example, I work with a research team consisting of scholars from Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, and we work together to think of important questions which are relevant to contemporary challenges. We engage with civil society actors, local populations, local government, international organizations. So we have a very strong impact and engagement aspect of our work, and this is becoming increasingly important to research today. And a lot of the funding that comes with research requires this of us. So in collaboration with the ILO on the topics of Indigenous people, climate change, and traditional knowledge, this really represents our interest in doing research that is relevant to today's global challenges. The topic of Indigenous people, climate change, and traditional knowledge is central to understanding the local dynamics of climate change within a historical perspective, which also considers socioeconomic dynamics. So this is truly an interdisciplinary project requiring attention to processes of change happening not only in climate, but also economics, technology, politics, and policy. So in this compendium, we sought to offer a perspective based on grounded research, on innovations and successful examples of ways in which traditional knowledge is practiced in response to climate change. The research presented has undergone a process of ethical review at the research design stage. Free, prior, and informed consent was taken from all study participants as set out in our research ethics protocols. One of our objectives in this compendium is to highlight the range of ways in which traditional knowledge is practiced by communities to meet their livelihood needs and cope with climate change. I have often said that with my work with Mongolian mobile pastoralists, with whom I've worked with closely for over a decade, I've said that they are the true adaptation experts. Their knowledge of environmental change, discerned through close observation and interaction with livestock, wildlife, and grassland conditions, as well as conservation skills, are greatly needed in the world today. In the age of consumerism, it is us who should be schooled in forms of traditional knowledge, which uphold principles of sustainability, these principles which have entered our vocabulary far too late. The compendium includes chapters focusing on a range of traditional livelihoods in a variety of places. The experiences of mobile pastoralists in Mongolia, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania highlight the extent to which climate change is already affecting the arid environments in which these livelihoods are practiced. Most of the authors take a participatory approach to their research, incorporating ethnographic methods in some cases. In addition to the range of research on mobile pastoralism, the case studies explore traditional water management in Timor-Leste, perceptions of environmental change in the Sapara Nation of the Ecuadorian Amazon, traditional medicine in Suriname, and the Aboriginal owned and operated Indigital project in Australia's Northern Territory. Through these case studies, we not only observe Indigenous peoples successfully coping with climate change-induced natural hazards, we also see how vulnerable environments are managed and protected through these practices. The Mongolian grassland ecosystem, for example, remains an important element in the Earth's climate system, and the capacity of grasslands to store carbon is significant given the extensive land area cover of this ecosystem. The practice of traditional livelihoods enables the sustainable management and use of these environments. So it can't be emphasized enough how important it is to preserve and understand traditional knowledge in these contexts. So now moving on to discussing the themes in the compendium, there are a few that I would like to highlight. Firstly, the role of customary institutions, which was mentioned previously, enables traditional knowledge to be practiced. So institutions, as many other scholars have done work on, such as Nobel Prize-winning Elinor Ostrom, are referring to the sets of working rules that are used to determine who is eligible to make decisions, what actions are allowed or constrained, what procedures are followed, etc. So the case studies in this compendium illustrate the value systems, beliefs, and social practices which constitute wider institutional structures. In the case of Mongolia, the practice of mobility and custodial beliefs towards land supports the sustainable use of grasslands. Other scholars have found that local institutions are key to successful adaptation to climate change and natural hazards. Recognizing the contribution of traditional knowledge, skills, and livelihoods in not only adapting but mitigating climate change requires recognition from broader state institutions. In Mongolia, for example, pastoralists not only need to respond to changing climatic conditions, but also fluctuating market prices for meat and wool, the expansion of mining across pastoralist territories, and constrained access to hospitals and schools, which are often based in urban centers. Despite these challenges, the Mongolian government and civil society actors, in collaboration with rural herders, are developing models for sustainable fiber supply chains, index-based livestock insurance, and continue to support mobile livelihoods by protecting common land tenure across the country. In the Timor-Leste case study, we also see the importance of custodial water management and the role of women in these gendered forms of labor. In this case, the community had been displaced to the coast from highland areas during the Indonesian era, but traditional knowledge was adapted to life in these coastal zones. For example, the customary practice of legal protection for certain areas was reapplied to coastal environments to protect fishing in certain areas and to ensure sustainable supplies of fish stocks. Again, the role of customary institutions is also clearly seen in the weather forecasting skills of Afar pastoralists in Ethiopia. Plants, insects, livestock, birds, wildlife are closely observed and are a source of information to guide climate-dependent livelihood decisions. Another theme I want to highlight in this compendium is the incorporation of new technologies as well as the fusion of traditional knowledge with more Western scientific models. This can be seen in one of the authors, Alison Hahn's work on pastoralist journalists among the Maasai of Tanzania. So the use of new and social media is increasingly the norm, which allows traditional knowledge and skills to be communicated globally. This chapter provides a detailed case study examining the ways in which Maasai pastoralists in East Africa have participated in debates and petitions about land rights through the production and distribution of videos and other online media productions. So the use of social media and new media has served to advance community knowledge and create new spaces for deliberation and decision-making. The use of new technology should be seen as part and parcel of Indigenous knowledge communication. And I'm just going to speak for a couple more minutes. Sorry to be taking so long. Similarly, Daniel Cooper and Nina Kruglakova's work on the digital economy of Indigenous knowledge describes and analyzes a recent Aboriginal startup called InDigital that integrates Indigenous knowledge with modern science and technology in order to preserve Indigenous heritage and contribute to the digital economy in innovative ways. So overall, this collection of case studies provides rich detail in the many ways that Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge is employed to cope with the challenge of climate change. There are certainly many more examples, but this compendium represents an attempt to continue and encourage more research on this topic and collaborations between diverse and interdisciplinary groups. It's also showing the amazingly innovative ways that Indigenous peoples are engaging with new platforms, new technologies, and dealing with a huge range of social and economic change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ariel, for that. And I should have also mentioned that you are a lecturer and course director in the program on nature science and environment governance in your department. So thank you so much for this rough overview. And there will be a lot to dive in for our panelists. And we open now basically really to those who were not part of this study, but they have heard about this study, and they will blend this also with their own experiences, where they come from the different stakeholders, from the indigenous people's perspective, from the local perspective, from government perspective, but also from the UN system-wide perspective. So we have a wide range, and I think this is a topic where the convergence of UN work is really very much needed, and perhaps needed the most these days, where climate change is an issue that is becoming very urgent to address. So it's actually climate change forcing us as a UN system also to work much closer together. And that's why we're also very happy to have United Nations Climate Change Secretariat part of this organizing group of this panel. And I would like to give the floor to Ms. Tiffany Hodson, who is the program officer in the adaptation program of the Secretariat in Bonn. And so I think it would be very interesting to hear from you how do you see these issues connected to the Paris Agreement? Or, I mean, could you frame this for us in the terms of the Paris Agreement, and also perhaps say what has happened since Paris on your end on these issues, and how do you see the synergies? Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Martin, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to be here representing the UNFCCC Secretariat. Thank you to the ILO for asking us to collaborate on this event, and also for the partnership that we've had with the ILO in respect to different Indigenous issues. It's an honor to be speaking on this panel with such esteemed speakers. So thank you very much for inviting us to speak today. Martin, you asked about the role of Indigenous peoples and the role of this work in the Paris Agreement. And I can start by saying at the climate change conference last year, COP24, that took place in Katowice in December, the role of Indigenous peoples in the implementation of the Paris Agreement came up a lot. And I'd use the words of the Indigenous youth leaders who described their role when they said that as youth, they feel the weight of climate change on their shoulders, and as Indigenous peoples, they hold the solutions. And I think that's a really important statement that they made there, and something that I would like to reflect here today. Our Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, she also describes the role of Indigenous peoples in the climate change process along the same lines. And to quote her, she says, "Indigenous peoples are part of the solution to climate change. This is because you have the traditional knowledge of your ancestors, and the important value of that knowledge simply cannot and must not be understated. Indigenous peoples are essential in finding solutions today and in the future, and the Paris Climate Change Agreement recognizes this. It recognizes your role in building a world that is resilient in the face of climate impacts." And she mentions the Paris Agreement a few times. This is a milestone agreement in our process in that it acknowledges that climate change is a common concern of humankind. It takes a more holistic view. It acknowledges that countries should respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Many of the Indigenous peoples here today have worked for decades to gain this recognition under our climate change process, and this achievement is ongoing as progress keeps building on this progress. The Paris Agreement, specifically on traditional knowledge, mentions it in Article 7 on adaptation, where it talks about basing adaptation on the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, amongst other forms of knowledge. Resilience to climate change is complexly intertwined with traditional knowledge, based on in-depth holistic understandings of Mother Earth that Indigenous peoples hold. In Paris, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform was established. This was another huge milestone. It paved the way for the momentous achievements that took place in the last 3 years, where Indigenous peoples and representatives of national governments work closely together to ensure that Indigenous peoples have a seat at the table when it comes to decisions that affect their lives, that affect their communities, and that affect the ecosystems that they protect. I realize that many people here today were part of this achievement. I have the honor of being part of the team that supports the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform and the discussions that take place, all the negotiations that go on for days and days and full nights, sitting in negotiation rooms. I see some familiar faces, looking more fresh than the previous time I saw you, myself included. And in the 10 years that I've been at the Secretariat, I've never seen other discussions, negotiations, where what you could call non-party stakeholders and parties, government officials, work together to negotiate. It's the first time that we've seen that in our process, and it's really something unprecedented. Just to say, during the Katowice negotiations, not one room was closed to Indigenous peoples representatives and to observers. Ivan can talk more about this. He was one of the key negotiators there. But it's really a first for our process. Even in the smallest room in the middle of the night, observers were allowed in, and they were there. So I think that we can definitely be proud of this achievement. And like I said, it's an honor for us as the Secretariat to support this. The platform and the facilitative working group, which I'll talk about, is built on decades of hard work by Indigenous peoples in their countries and under the UN. In the implementation of the Paris Agreement, we also build on achievements that have taken place under the CBD, under the ILO with Convention 169, and under the UNFIII. But we still have a long way to go. The platform is not meant to be a catch-all for all the Indigenous issues under the Convention. That's not why it was established. Its functions, if well implemented, will ensure that traditional knowledge permeates other areas of the agreement, such as the nationally determined contributions. It can increasingly ensure that Indigenous peoples can help the world to tackle climate change. It'll build the capacity of governments to work with Indigenous peoples. It can ensure that diverse knowledge systems, practices, and innovations are integrated into the adaptation and mitigation of countries. And on top of that, not just looking at adaptation and mitigation, it's important that giving Indigenous peoples a voice can help steer the world towards a sustainable, clean future and away from the fossil fuels that are polluting our Mother Earth. So just in terms of how the UNFCCC can ensure that traditional knowledge can be promoted and recent developments that Martin asked about, I can pinpoint the three main developments. I've already touched on them. So the establishment of the platform in 2015, its operationalization last year, May, when the first activity was held, and then December last year when the facilitative working group was established. So this is a new constituted body under our process. And all of these are linked to traditional knowledge. So this new constituted body consists of 14 members, half of which are Indigenous peoples representatives and half of which are representing governments. This kind of balance in a constituted body is also a first for our process, and all Indigenous representatives were appointed by Indigenous peoples through their own customs and procedures. So I think in the UN process, this is also quite unprecedented. The representative that negotiated for the Indigenous peoples, who spoke for them in Katowice, Ghazali's here. I told him I would quote him. He was warned. He said at the end of the Katowice conference, when Indigenous peoples first came to the UN process, we had a dream. We had a dream that Indigenous peoples and states can work together. And with the platform operationalized, that dream has become reality. So those are not my words, but I think they're really good words. And I think that's something that can motivate all of us to build on that and keep building on the momentum that has already been established. The facilitative working group will ensure that the functions of the platform are implemented, including the function related to traditional knowledge, which is the theme here today. I'm just going to skip ahead. I don't think I've got too much time, but just to make sure that everyone knows sort of what the next steps are for our process. The first meeting of the facilitative working group will take place just before our next climate change conference, so the 14th to the 16th of June. And remote participation will be available. We will be webcasting it. It'll be open. So we do hope to get as much participation as possible from observers. Other activities are also going to be taking place during the session, and I'm happy to talk more about those with you. I see a lot of opportunity also to engage more with the ILO and others on the work that they're doing and to collaborate with UN entities that also work on Indigenous issues. The global response to climate change requires applying all of the best knowledge available, working together, learning from each other in order to meet the climate change goal of staying well below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as possible. Indigenous peoples are some of the most vulnerable to climate impacts, but also the key to learning how to live in harmony with Mother Nature. So research like this that has been undertaken by Oxford and the ILO, which shares case studies, practical examples of how traditional knowledge cuts across numerous aspects of sustainability and resilience, can help to educate policymakers, help to get better decisions, more informed, knowledgeable decisions being made that affect people's lives and that affect people's communities when it comes to climate change. So we do hope that the ILO can share this knowledge, that Oxford can also come to the next session where we have a lot of activities and share this knowledge further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and also for reminding that many of you in the room here are very active and involved participants in this journey here, and I think this is very appreciated that so many of you are here. Now, we are also the co-chair of the Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Issues in the ILO, in the UN system. As the ILO, we are co-chairing this year, so I think your suggestion to talk about amongst agencies more, what can we do really on this is very important pointer coming out from your presentation. Also worth a follow-up in addition, of course, that we will be very pleased to bring all of this to the process that you are steering out of Bonn. So Now it's really a pleasure to turn to Joan Carling, and I always introduce you by saying that you are the one that don't need an introduction. But let me nevertheless say, for the sake of it, that you have been a dedicated leader on these issues, indigenous peoples, and the things that are around, around this very important concern over many years. It says here in my notes 20 years, but I don't want to give exact numbers because this is delicate. I also wanted just to highlight that you have been awarded last year the Champion of the Earth Award, Lifetime Achievement Award, with 2 heads of states actually together. So we are very honored to have you in our panel today, and we look very forward to what you have to tell us today. You have the floor.
Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the research. I think that's a very important contribution in our work in promoting the protection of traditional knowledge. The report actually confirms our observations, and it provides deeper insights on the realities on the ground, on how indigenous peoples are adapting to climate change, and the vital role of traditional knowledge. At the same time, we also see the huge gap between the recognition of traditional knowledge at the global level and the protection of traditional knowledge on the ground. While, of course, indigenous peoples are persistent in the practice of their traditional knowledge, but there are so many threats, and it has been also demonstrated in the study that these threats are getting serious. But what I want to emphasize is that the threats to traditional knowledge is not isolated from the threats to the exercise and protection of indigenous people's rights, because we cannot isolate or delink traditional knowledge from rights of indigenous peoples, because it's the rights of indigenous peoples that enables traditional knowledge to flourish. And what rights are these? The rights to land, territories, and resources, cultural heritage, self-determination, as well as sustainable occupations and livelihoods of the peoples, because this is where traditional knowledge is being used and practiced. We cannot, traditional knowledge is based on our reciprocal relations with nature. And so if we are, and that means to our territory. So if we are driven out of our territory, then our traditional knowledge will eventually be diminished, because we're taken out from the area where it's being practiced and where it can be enhanced. That's the one point that I want to make. The other one is on the role of indigenous women. And that has also been clearly demonstrated in the case studies, that we cannot undervalue the roles and contributions of women. Indigenous women are the embodiment of traditional knowledge. And thereby, we also need to protect the rights of indigenous women. We also need to make sure that they take part in decision-making, because if they don't take part in decision-making, then how that traditional knowledge that they embody is going to also be enhanced, and more importantly, the transmission of traditional knowledge to the younger generation. If indigenous women are experiencing violence, then that does not provide the enabling environment for them to continue as the holders of traditional knowledge. If women are taken out of the land, how will they continue to practice their knowledge in providing and developing the food systems? How can they continue to play the role as healers, as medicine, as providers of medicine, and how can they take care of the well-being of their children and their families using the natural environment? So these are the link also to indigenous women. The other one that has also been pointed out is the importance of customary systems, customary institutions, because it's the customary institutions that are guiding the collective enhancement of traditional knowledge that enhances the cooperation, the unity of communities, and how they can help each other to survive and develop using traditional knowledge and innovations. Because of course, I refuse to say that, because a lot of people are saying that traditional knowledge is stuck. Of course it's not. It's an evolving knowledge, and it's adapting to the changes in the environment. It's adapting to the changes in our realities. Now, I was asked to, the key question now is, how is traditional knowledge linked to decent work? And for indigenous peoples, traditional occupation is decent work. It is decent work. And in fact, it is a decent work that leads to sustainability. It's decent work that strengthens our resilience. It's decent work that enhances our cooperation. But the reality is, traditional occupations are being criminalized. Pastoralists, hunters and gatherers are penalized when they practice their traditional occupations. If you don't know, thousands of indigenous peoples are in jail because of their practice of traditional knowledge. And this is not being discussed. There is no attention to this. I remember, even in the town next to my village in the Philippines, one of the members of that tribe cut some trees in their area to build a house for his child who's going to get married. But because cutting trees is illegal, he was sentenced to jail for 10 years. 10 years. And it becomes also an issue of justice. It becomes an issue of social justice. It also undermines, if we criminalize traditional occupations that embodies traditional knowledge, by the way, because traditional occupation was built through our interaction with nature with the lens of sustainability, because we want that the future generation has something to live by, right? So sustainability is built in. So we use our environment based on what we need. Not for commercial exploitation, not for opportunism, to get rich and exploit others. It's not like that. So it also comes with important values. Values of cooperation, values of simplicity, values of that these resources are not just for us, we are the stewards, it is also for the future generation. Those are the values that embodies how we also practice our traditional occupations that also leads to sustainable resource management systems. So this is an area where we need to the wider community, the public, to understand that traditional occupations are decent work and are contributing to sustainability, and it thereby needs to be protected, which will also ensure that traditional knowledge will flourish and benefit the world. Now, in relation to where I work, because that's part of the question, how is traditional knowledge linked to SDGs, right? Is it relevant to achieving sustainable development? It is at the core. So traditional knowledge is at the core of indigenous people's well-being. So without that, sustainable development will not be achieved. And in fact, in the SDGs, it is legal, it's recognized under the means of implementation, particularly under the science, technology, and innovations. That traditional knowledge is as equally important as scientific knowledge, and it contributes to achieving, it has a vital contribution to achieving sustainable development, because it also strengthens sustainability and community resilience. So it is valued in the agreement. The problem is it's not mainstream all the way through in the goals. For example, on quality education, where it matters, right? If it's considered as a valuable knowledge, then it has to be part of access to quality education, particular not only for indigenous peoples, but for the rest of the world. It's as good as scientific knowledge, so it should be part of formal and informal education. What are the other values of traditional knowledge to SDGs? Like I already emphasized later that we cannot isolate it from the issue of indigenous people's rights, because traditional knowledge also leads to sustainable resource management systems that provides us with what we need to be able to survive, and also allows us to contribute to achieving sustainable development in the context of, for example, food security, health and well-being, addressing inequality. These are important elements of sustainable development, where rights and traditional knowledge has to be factored in and accounted for. So I just want to say that while it is not is still mainstream in the SDG, it never provides us the opportunity to work with others, like, for example, with the whole UN system, where they need to also promote and respect rights and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. It's also an opportunity for us to collaborate with academic institutions, research institutions, on how to use traditional knowledge as evidence that indigenous peoples are actually contributing to sustainable development. So we can also use that as a leverage and as an entry point to what's this, link it to other dimensions, the issues of equality, the issues of non-discrimination, the issues of environment protection, and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joanna, for putting really the things together for us here. That's excellent, and we wanted to thank you, of course, also for as co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, for the SDGs, because you were also part of the group that have put this together, to be very transparent here. But let me say that there's many things that here, and it would be impossible to repeat, but this idea of traditional knowledge as something not being static, but you used enhanced, the word enhanced, even indigenous peoples looking to enhancing their traditional knowledge systems. So there's many things that some echo our research, but at the same time complement it. So thank you for that, and I'm sure we'll come back to you in the discussion. Now, we turn now to a governmental speaker. I'm happy to introduce Mr. Ivan Zambrana Flores. He's the Executive Director of the Plurinational Authority of Mother Earth of the government of Bolivia. We are very pleased to have you on this panel. You are a biologist with master's degrees from Columbia, and you are also a doctoral candidate from Oxford. And so you have switched from academia to public policy making at the international level, actually. So it's going to be very interesting to hear from you what you feel about this research, how you think, how this reflects also your experience, and how this links to the challenges that you see at the international level, maybe also perhaps back home in the work that you do.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, ILO and everybody here for helping me address you with some, deliver you some words about the Bolivian experience. Initially, I would like to say that everything that is happening in Bolivia is not, we don't see it just as an achievement of the government. In particular, because we decided to elect an indigenous president 13 years ago, what has been happening in Bolivia is a co-evolution of both indigenous movements and the structure itself of the state. And I think that's something that has been happening in a very fast way, and it has, obviously, it has been influencing the way government is being functioning, which is, I think, crucial in order to advance the interests of indigenous peoples within our country and at some extent outside our country. In general, I would say that some of the biggest accomplishments we had regarding the seat at the table that Tiffany was mentioning in Bolivia is that now we have a constitution that acknowledges all our plurinationality, which is important in order to transform the different branches of government in order to incorporate indigenous peoples, not only from a representation perspective, but also in a way that they could themselves transform the way the executive works, the way the legislative branch works, and even the judiciary branch. This also has been happening not only in the decision-making levels of government, but also in the way research is being happening. From a couple of, no, not a couple, from I think 8 years ago, we now have 3 indigenous universities that are located in the 3 main ecoregions of the country in order to not just protect indigenous knowledge, but try to find the interfaces between indigenous knowledge and a national policy, which is, as it was said by Joan and others, it's important in order to really look for and mainstream solutions that not only come from the knowledge of indigenous peoples, but that come from the values that are associated to those to that traditional knowledge. One example of that is that in Bolivia, Mother Earth is not a concept that is only being delivered or it's being handled by indigenous peoples. It now has become a concept that guides most of sustainability policy in the country. That's why to see Mother Earth beyond this metaphysical entity and go and move to an understanding that would acknowledge Mother Earth as a living system has been crucial in order to develop specific policies. For example, the Bolivian proposal that is an alternative to RED and RED Plus schemes that it's called the Joint Mitigation and Adaptation Mechanism for the Integral and Sustainable Management of Forests. That is a very concrete example of how policies can emerge from that inter-scientific dialogue between Western sciences and indigenous peoples' knowledge production systems. I see many examples of that in this study. I think that it's important to use spaces like the platform that has been operationalized in the context of the Convention on Climate Change in order to allow for those local traditional knowledges, experiences to permeate governments and to change the way governments carry their general climate change policies. There are some other examples of that, and I think that has proved important in many contexts, and it surely should become the norm in the future for not only climate action, but even the way the convention works and the way the Paris Agreement is going to be implemented. I am very hopeful that the global stocktake is going to help us to put actual proof, evidence for that, but we are preparing the conditions for that. We are trying to develop the conditions for that. In the context, for example, in the specific context of the UN Convention on Climate Change, I think that it has been really important to work, as it was said before, for us governments that acknowledge indigenous peoples and that want to promote the rights of indigenous peoples. It has been really important to work with indigenous organizations because from that dialogue, we were able to come up with solutions for some of the roadblocks we had in that process. Last year, we had, for example, an informal meeting in Bolivia that we called TINCU, which means gathering, meeting, but a violent meeting in a way that helped us to put all the issues on the table and try to solve them with governments and with indigenous peoples. I think that was a breakthrough because that allowed us to move faster through issues during the negotiation, and we were able to go, and it's funny that I would say this, but it helped us to go even beyond the original mandate for the platform. Because the original mandate was for the exchange of knowledge. And now the platform has three main functions, which is really important for us to move them together. And those are knowledge exchange, but also capacity building and policy for climate action. That we wanted to include those as well because, as I said before, that's the only way we are going to have a transformative influence in the way we deal with climate change, both from the perspective of Western sciences and also with the interaction of those sciences with indigenous knowledge systems. Just as a final point, it's something that is also already happening in the IPCC process because the sixth assessment report is going to include, for the first time, the acknowledgement and the review of what is out there regarding indigenous knowledge systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for describing the role also of Bolivia and how Bolivia's own changes in terms of governments have also been a part of that. And we were invited to the TINCU. We could not come, and we now regret it very much. So we will be there next time. Now, we come to our final panel speaker, and I shall say that our speakers are very disciplined all in keeping their time limits, and I did not even have to say how many minutes they have. They have understood how much time we have as a total. So that is maybe also traditional knowledge, because some of them are attending the permanent forum for many years. So, and one of them is, of course, Palab Chakma here from Bangladesh. As the ILO, we have been working many years also to work with the government and indigenous peoples and with our constituents on indigenous and tribal peoples issues. And so we're very glad to have you also here. You're the executive director of the Campaign Foundation, one of the major organizations in the country. You are also part of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, who is also co-sponsoring this panel today. And obviously you are really the one that is from the community. I mean, Joanne as well, but she is a global leader and She is also, I think she, honest to say, she spends more time in planes and in gatherings. So, but we will hear from you now, and you're the last speaker, so you have also the opportunity to pack in what you thought about what others have said here. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Actually, as the last panel speaker, it is also my benefit to not to share much, because already many things already shared. All the learned colleagues already shared many things about it. So, as I am from Bangladesh, Bangladesh is one of the economically rising country, but on the other hand, one of the most climate change vulnerability country. So, climate change induced different problems are hampering the regular development of Bangladesh. So in the community level also, we are having lots of problems which are connected with climate change. So if I mention some of those, one thing is agriculture-based production is hampering due to climate change. For example, due to heavy rainfall or seasonal droughts, everything is hampering the agricultural production. And also flash flood. Due to heavy rainfall, we are having flash flood, and Bangladesh is one of the flood-prone country. So we are having lots of floods. Very recently, which is very new for us, even as I am from Chittagong Hill Tract, this is the mountainous region. So we very often we rarely have flash flood, but recent years we are having these floods regularly, and it's also hampering the overall life and livelihood of indigenous and local people. And another thing is landslide. And due to heavy rainfall, we are having landslide. And in 2017, the 12th June, there was a landslide, and that killed almost 152 people in Chittagong Hill Tracts alone. So this is very alarming for us. And the another thing is salinity. Due to frequent cyclone, so our coastal regions where indigenous and tribal people also living there, and it's local communities, they are having problem with their production, because most of the crops cannot tolerate the salinity. So this also helping or causing the regular agricultural production. And also, if I mention about some of the health-related problems, due to extreme temperature, local people are having some kinds of physical problem, and also crop drop. There's also it is climate change induced problem that some crops are not growing in the changed environment. And so these are some of the problems, and for addressing all those things, we indigenous peoples, for generations, we are practicing some kinds of traditional knowledge which are helping to address all these problems. But still, right at this moment, traditional knowledge are not enough to respond all these problems. That's why we, our indigenous people, are demanding, by respecting indigenous people's traditional knowledge, how we can scale up all these things with the help of government, all different international development agencies, by respecting indigenous people's traditional knowledge. So if we say something about the solutions, suppose indigenous peoples have the traditional knowledge of practicing shifting cultivation, which is also known as slash and burn cultivation. So indigenous people's shifting cultivation is not about the cutting and burning all these things. So it is a total process of or ecosystem, and also helping or nurturing the nature to produce their own variety of crops. So this traditional knowledge can be practiced and followed to address some of the issues regarding the crop drops, and also to address the agricultural production. And also, indigenous people contribute much in the field of managing forest, and it is the traditional knowledge of indigenous people. They know the way how to preserve and protect nature and Mother Earth. So we can follow that traditional knowledge of forest management of indigenous people. At the same time, the traditional way of planting medicinal plant and herbs. So these also contribute to address the issues of health-related issues in the changed environment due to. And also, finally, another thing, very interesting thing, that indigenous people, they traditionally know for generations, that is weather forecasting, considering or reviewing or observing the different animals' movement or their sound. And then through this way, they know how or when it would be heavy rainfall or when it would be dry season, so all these things. So following all this knowledge, the agriculture producers and also traditional indigenous and local community can produce their crops accordingly. But problem is, our traditional knowledge is not recognized in many parts of the world. So that's why we are demanding repeatedly to address or to recognize our traditional knowledge so that we can combinedly address the climate change induced problems at different regions. So in Bangladesh, as Martin was mentioning, we combinedly working with ILO. So right now we are implementing, working together to generate community data and through Indigenous Navigator project. So as you all know, with indigenous people are having problem with data, we don't have sufficient data or the disaggregated data by ethnicity. That's why we don't know many things. If we want to measure our progress in terms of health-related problems, education-related problem, we don't have that much data. That's why Indigenous Navigator project is helping us to generate data driven by the community. So as we are part of ILO, and at country level and also globally, ILO works as tripartite coordinator. So in Bangladesh, National Coordination Committee for Workers' Education, they are represented by the trade unions, and also Bangladesh Employers Federation, that is represented by the small entrepreneur and also large-scale industries leaders, and also Ministry of Labor and Environment. So these tripartite, when they meet together, they discuss together, some kinds of collaboration is there, and so far we observe that this is effective and very collaborative mechanism to address or to share their experiences. So through this mechanism, we are engaged with the government also. So the outcomes that we are getting from the community through the Indigenous Navigator project, those data are shared with these trade unions and also employers associations, and even also Ministry of Labor and Employment. And also ILO is not only connected with only Ministry of Labor and Employment, there are other ministries also connected with ILO, so we can also share our data and findings through these government initiatives. So we, as a signatory of different ILO convention, ILO Convention 107, and also ILO Convention on 111. So when Bangladesh government is going to report about all these treaties and conventions, Bangladesh government need to report, and they have to collect data information. So during that time, our government and our government agencies, they may review all these data information. Those are generated from the indigenous navigator. So I believe through this cooperative way, we together can address many problems, and we thank ILO for having the Indigenous Navigator project in Bangladesh, and we are looking forward to work closely in future days. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this impressions from your side. And yeah, thank you also for mentioning, of course, the tripartite partners of the ILO. I should have said that because I represent the ILO, but we are even more pleased if it comes from one of our partners. So that shows also the way that we work closely together. And also thank you for mentioning some of the ILO conventions that are relevant to these issues. We hear a lot about Convention 169 here, but there are other conventions that are very relevant, including Convention 111 that was mentioned here, which is discrimination in employment and occupation, which includes access to traditional occupation. So these are quite important points that you have added to this panel. So we will open now up for questions and comments. We have, according to our schedule, 15 minutes, and we might be able to overdo that by 5 minutes. So, but nevertheless, we are a lot of people in this room, and we want to give as much as possible the opportunity to ask questions. So we would, I would suggest that if you want to make a comment, make it short, but in any case, ask a question to one of the panelists that are here on the panel. And I'll go straight away to you, madam, here in the middle. You have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the excellent panel discussion. Climate change is caused by human greed. And indigenous people, I'm Beena Nepram from Manipur in northeast of India, borders Burma. And we have known that we have never led our life with greed and motive. We have led egalitarian life. So the title of your research should be Indigenous Peoples are Solutions and Leaders of Climate Change. Just a suggestion. The second question is in terms of, have you incorporated the concepts of environmental violence as well as environmental justice in the mapping of your research? And second question is, how many indigenous people were involved in your research? Because right now we are fed up with the colonization of our research, of our work. Why only ILO? Why only Oxford? Why not Dhaka University or Sylhet University or Manipur University or Nagaland University? So I think it's very important that we got to decolonize our research so that we're able to get more things from the ground. And finally, our indigenous traditional knowledge has always been mocked at. For example, in northeast of India, we eat fermented fish, which helps in some diseases, but we are mocked for eating stinky food. Or, for example, criminalization of eating bamboo shoot in the state of Tripura. So again, we got to work with our governments to tell, do not decriminalize our lands, our food habits, and our way of life, because it's happening. In as much we try to tell that in this room it's nice, but beyond this room, our lives are absolutely one of exploitation, of lack of representation in every way possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this comment and also the questions. And I will direct the question right away to the research coordinators here on the podium. I look forward to Ariel and to Rishabh, who wants to talk first. Yeah, they are pointing to each other. So let's go with the University of Oxford first.
Thank you very much for your comments, and that is definitely a great name for the title. But Rishabh will have to respond to that question. But we have highlighted those points within the compendium. They're highlighted in the introductory chapter and summary chapter. So although the title doesn't have that front and center, we have made those points throughout the compendium. In terms of the environmental violence and justice comment, which is extremely important, the brief for this compendium was to focus more on innovation and successful examples. And And so in that sense, we try to focus it on some positive stories where we can continue to gain traction and highlight ways that people have been successful with using traditional knowledge to gain more either, for example, in the Maasai case, a platform for being part of decision making, or to highlight ways in which traditional knowledge is used to deal with climate change in successful ways. The compendium, we put out a big call to many universities across the world. We have at least one contribution dealing with Afar pastoralists in northern Ethiopia, which has a contribution from two co-authors from Ethiopia on that topic. So we have indigenous voices within the compendium, which we always try to do as best as we can. So we did send out a big call, and those were the people that responded and that were able to contribute to the research brief. But for the other points, I'd like to hand over to Rishabh, who I think can address in more detail. Thank you very much.
Rishabh.
Thank you so much for your question. Now, firstly, this publication is a second publication in line. Our first publication, which we released also in the Permanent Forum 2 years ago, was called Indigenous Peoples and Climate Change, Indigenous Peoples Agents of Change. And that is in line with what you basically are talking about. And in that compendium, we deal with, well, that's not a compendium, that's more of a report, where we deal with the issue of environmental justice, where we deal more explicitly with the issue of threats from climate change, but not just from the environment, but all the social aspects associated with climate change. So what I initially sort of touched upon, poverty, inequality, lack of rights, lack of institutional recognition, so on and so forth. So that we deal with. So this is a follow-up to that. So that was to highlight the threats and the potential opportunities. This is to talk about how those opportunities can concretely be realized. But it's important that you talk about the issue of environmental justice, and as the ILO, we are the organization who talk about social justice, and we've been doing that for the past 100 years. In this case, it is very, very relevant because environmental justice and social justice can be the two sides of the same coin. And to promote social justice for indigenous people would also, additionally, also promote environmental justice.
Yes, I have two more comments here. The gentleman in the green shirt, please.
Good afternoon. Great presentation of the panelists. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Rafael Latorre. I represent thousands of cultivators and cocalero families in the Amazon and the Andean mountains of South America. According to the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, $140 billion has been used in the drug against in the war against drugs in the last 20 years. However, the war is lost. There is more drug abuse in the world. There's more death for opiates, more environmental destructions. There was this past week. There was a study that says the Amazon has lost the size of Ecuador in the last 10 years. How can we use more? How can we use these funds more wisely instead of killing us each other, instead of destroying the environment? How can we use or put up this monies more wisely in order to support these cocalero families? That was my question.
Thank you very much for that question, and I'll go to the gentleman in the back for another question.
To that side as well.
Oh, yes.
Why don't we speak?
In your research and the compendium, in both volumes, did you go through formal protocols of protection of indigenous knowledge with the nations and with the peoples? it's a process. The bid just did that sort of thing. It takes time. The Chortí people, it took them 2 years before they let bid have access to IDB, to what they were doing. And my question is, I think this is very important from my experience. I still have the question of whether you did it, because it changes research methodology. Once the indigenous people have signed a protocol of control of that investigation and that knowledge, they usually have more input on research methodology, exactly what the communities do to prepare the project, and that changes. But I hope, I just want to know, did you do protocols in some, in all, not individual protocols for indigenous nations?
Thank you so much for this question that relates to the research methodology. And I'll take a third question from the right side of the room. Sir, please, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Kobe from Kenya. My question is about, did you consider in your limitation to the research, do you consider the land challenges which are faced by indigenous peoples, whereby they are unable to use their traditional knowledge or practice because already they are having challenges with their land ownership and land use in their specific countries? So I don't know, because sometimes we may want to consider it as it was real, but whenever there is land issues among indigenous peoples, the use of traditional knowledge become a challenge.
Thank you very much for that question. So we ask now the panelists here to make basically closing remarks, and in going through the closing remarks, also to reply to the questions that were posed, because they were not addressed to specific panelists here. So if you have something to contribute to the responding to the questions, then please do so. So let's go in the final round, and we start this time with Palap, and then we go the same way.
I just want to respond about our sister Binna Lakshmi. She mentioned about the representation. I also personally feel that our representation should be ensured in every level of policy making dialogue, and even when our national government is enacting any laws and policies that affect the life and livelihood of indigenous people, indigenous representation should be there. There is my comments. And another thing is, my brother from Kenya just mentioned about the land challenges and land use, all these things. So at the ground level, we are having this type of problem, the land problem, and also our lands are being grabbed in the name of development projects. And also, so we are having lots of problems, and also the land use policies should be adopted by our national government. And in those processes, indigenous people's representation should be ensured. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ivan, I think you would be the next if we go in reverse order.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments regarding methodologies. I fully agree. I think that we have to promote more locally driven research in indigenous universities, but also I think as somebody that is linked to Oxford University, we have to subvert Oxford as well. We have to try to change it. The first image I had from Oxford was the Anthropology Museum, and it's still a collection of prizes. So we have to subvert every aspect of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, I think. And regarding ecological or environmental justice, there is now an opportunity in the climate change regime, because for the first time, climate justice is mentioned in the preamble. But we have to operationalize it. And we have to operationalize it beyond lawsuits and beyond trials. We have to to move from a punitive justice to a restorative justice. And that's something that it's also, I think, important for the promotion of indigenous rights.
Thank you so much. We were just told we have to wrap it up in 2 minutes, so that leaves 30 seconds for the remaining speakers here on the panel. Joanne, please.
Yeah, it's mainly to say that we need a human rights and social justice approach to climate change, and it is important for indigenous peoples at the front and center in finding solutions to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tiffany?
Just a very short comment to get back to what the lady here was saying about not colonizing research, having respect for the research and the knowledge, etc. I think this kind of input is really useful for us as we're developing a dedicated web portal under the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So any kind of feedback like that on what kind of knowledge should be on this platform, who should put it there and who should decide is very useful for us. So thank you very much for that comment.
So we will conclude this event, and our co-designers of this study, they get away. But we invite those who want to find out more about the research methodology. There was a question of the protocol to approach directly the research coordinators. I would like to thank all of you for the participation, the excellent comments and questions, and we look forward to engaging with all of you further on these issues. Thank you so much.